Hello, it is time for another Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. And I'm going to be going through. This is chapter 29, Another Man at Manresa, the Catholic Reformation. In 1521, the year that Martin Luther stood before Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms, a young Spanish nobleman was fighting on the emperor's borderlands against the invading French Pamplona. A cannonball shattered one of his legs. During a long, painful convalescence, he turned out of boredom to two popular inspirational works, one on the lives of the saints and the other on the life of Christ. With these, his long process of conversion began. Months later, at the Benedictine Abbey of Montserrat, he exchanged his gentleman's clothes for rough pilgrim's garb and dedicated his sword and dagger to the shrine's Black Virgin. For nearly a year, in a little town called Manresa, 30 miles north of Barcelona, he gave himself to austerity. Sorry, another yawn. He gave himself to austerity, begging door to door, wearing a barbed girdle, fasting for days on end. For months he endured the terrible depressions of the mystic's dark night of the soul, even contemplating suicide at one point. But what followed was the mystic's singular reward, an immense breakthrough to spiritual enlightenment. In a wave of ecstatic illumination one day at the river Cardoner, the wounded nobleman, Ignatius Loyola, became, in his own words, another man. Loyola, who was from 1491 to 1556, transformed his rebirth at Manresa to a plan for spiritual discipline and military manual for special forces at the service of the Pope. The result was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, the greatest single force in Catholicism's campaign to recapture the spiritual domains seized by Protestantism. How did the Church of Rome respond to the Protestant challenge? It didn't, not immediately. But when it finally realized the seriousness of the revolt, it called upon its spiritual warriors. It convened a new militant council, and it reformed. I'm sorry. I need to drink some coffee. It's actually chai tea, but it has some caffeine in it. I shall not yawn at all after this. How did the Church of Rome respond to the Protestant challenge? It didn't, not immediately, but when it finally realized the seriousness of the revolt, it called upon its spiritual warriors. It convened a new militant council, and it reformed the machinery of the papal office, faced by the rebellion of almost half of Europe. Another thing is that the church and the government were so intertwined that it kind of naturally led to some of this, because it wasn't, that caused some issues. All right, faced by the rebellion of almost half of Europe, Catholicism rolled back the tide of Protestantism until by the end of the 16th century, Protestantism was limited roughly to the northern third of Europe, as it is today. Some historians have interpreted the Catholic Reformation as a counterattack against Protestantism. Others have described it as a genuine revival of Catholic piety with few thoughts of Protestantism. The truth is the movement was both a counter-reformation, as Protestants insist, and a Catholic Reformation, as Catholics argue. Its roots run back to forces before Luther's time, but the form it took was largely determined by the Protestant attack. Next section, return to the spiritual. Strange as it may seem, the mystical experience was a large part of Catholicism's recovery. The 16th century produced a remarkable variety of Catholic saints. English lawyer and statesman Thomas More, cheerful and imaginative missionary to the Calvinists, Francis of Sales, somber reforming Archbishop Milan Charles Borromeo, rapturous Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila, and most influential of all, Spanish soldier of Christ Ignatius Loyola. Even before Luther posted his thesis on the church door, a distinguished and aristocratic group at Rome had formed a prized brotherhood called the Oratory of Divine Love. Their guiding belief was that the reformation of the church and society begins with the individual soul. The oratory was never large in number, perhaps 50, yet it had enormous influence. It stimulated reform in the older monastic orders and contributed leaders to the Church of Rome as it laid plans for a general council to deal with internal reform and the Protestant heresy. Among the members of the oratory who later emerged as significant figures were Jacobo Salodetto, who debated with Calvin, Reginald Pole, who tried under Bloody Mary to turn England back to Rome, and Gian Pietro Cartagaffa, who became Pope Paul IV. Throughout the 1520s and 1530s, however, the Church of Rome took no significant steps toward reform. The question is why? Why was she so slow to respond to the Protestant challenge? One simple answer is politics. Emperor Charles V and the popes one simple answer is politics. Emperor Charles V and the popes fought a running battle over the calling of a general council that stretched over 2 decades. Luther had called for a council of the church as early as 1518. The idea gained the support of the German princes and the emperor, but the popes feared such an assembly. They remembered too well the councils of Constance and Basel. They also knew that many in Germany had in mind a council without the pope. Equally important, the popes in 1520 and 1530 were preoccupied with secular and political affairs. Clement VII, 1523 to 1534, is a prominent example. He regarded concern for the papal states in Italy as a supreme law, and his passion for papal political fortunes drew him into an alliance with France against Charles V, leader of the Habsburg interests in Italy. The Pope's treachery and disloyalty enraged Charles, and he threatened Clement with a trial before the General Council unless he broke his alliance with Francis I, King of France. To show the Pope he meant business, Charles ordered his troops to march on Rome, and it turned out he got more than he had planned for. The commanders of his troops were killed. As a result, the rough and undisciplined Spanish and German mercenaries were leaderless when they stormed Rome on May 6th of 1527. Their pillaging, plundering, and murdering in the Eternal City lasted for weeks. The Pope took refuge in the castle of St. Angelo, but finally had to surrender and endure half a year of harsh imprisonment. Many considered his sack of Rome a terrible visitation by God, a clear call to repentance and change in the worldly papacy. No serious reform came until Pope Paul III, 1534 to 1549, ascended the papal throne. It's interesting, it's literally called like the papal throne. It's just kind of, Paul appeared to be a most unlikely candidate for spiritual leadership. He had 3 illegitimate sons and a daughter, 4 striking reminders of his pursuit of pleasure. The sack of Rome, however, seemed to have sobered him. He realized that the time had come for reform to begin in the house of God. He started where he felt a change of heart was most urgently needed, in the College of Cardinals. He appointed to the college a number of champions of reform. Among them were leaders in the oratory of divine love, Sadoleto, Pole, and Carafa. I might not be saying those correctly. The first one, Sadoleto, Sadoleto, and then Pole, just Pole, and then Carafa, it's like Caraffa. So, Paul then appointed 9 of the new cardinals to a reform commission. The head of the commission was another former member of the oratory, Gasparo Contarini. A peacemaker by temperament, Contarini stood for reconciliation with the Protestants and advocated a return to the faith of the apostles. After a wide-ranging study of conditions in the Church of Rome, the commission issued in 1537 a formal report, Advice Concerning the Reform of the Church. Disorder in the church, the report said, could be traced directly to the need for reform. The papal office was too secular. Both popes and cardinals needed to give more attention to spiritual matters and stop flirting with the world. Bribery in high places, abuses of indulgences, invasions of church law, prostitution in Rome. These and other offenses must cease. Next section. Call for a general council. If the Catholics had a different pope, like early on, that was willing to do reforms, and if they hadn't waited so long to do a council, they might have solved their Protestant problem, which might not be a good thing if it did happen, because I'm not Catholic, but they could have probably done some reforms a lot earlier and not hidden from having a council while the Protestants were still genuinely willing to do it. Okay, call for a general council. Pope Paul took action on a few of these items, but his most significant response was a call for a general council of the church. After intense negotiations, he agreed with the emperor on a location for the assembly, a town in northern Italy under imperial control called Trent. Apologies for the yawning. About to quickly drink some more tea. Anyone who watches this, use this time to drink some coffee if you'd like. Okay, the assembly is going to happen in a town in northern Italy under imperial control called Trent. Even then, however, no council assembled for years because Francis I did everything in his power to prevent such a gathering. In his passion for leadership of Europe, he feared a council would only strengthen Charles's hand. Francis even stopped inciting the Turks against the emperor. Two wars between Francis and Charles delayed the opening of a council until almost 1545, almost 3 decades after Luther's theses appeared. That's like a lifetime. That is, okay, by 1545, Rome was under the spell of a new austerity. Reform was on the rise. The immoralities of Paul's younger days were no longer acceptable behavior. The Pope's new rigor was apparent in the institution of the Roman Inquisition and in the index of prohibited books, the reading of which caused any Catholic to risk damnation. Yikes. All the books of the Reformers were listed, as well as Protestant Bibles. For a long time, Protestant Bibles are just Bibles with a few less books. So you're like, are going to risk damnation if you read those books in that particular form. Sorry. All the books of the Reformers were listed as well as Protestant Bibles. For a long time, merely to possess one of these banned books in Spain was punishable by death. The index was kept up to date until 1959 and was finally abolished by Pope Paul VI. So, it was technically still, where, according to what was written by this other guy, all those books were still on the list. And all these people, without even knowing it, were maybe picking up a Protestant Bible every now and then and reading parts of it, not realizing that their eternal soul was at stake. All right, Ignatius Loyola. Next section. It was this city, a new militant Rome, and this Pope, Paul III, who approved Ignatius Loyola's new Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. These daring soldiers of Christ promised the Pope that they would go wherever he might send them, whether to the Turks or to the New World, or to the Lutherans or to others. But be they infidel or faithful. That was a quotation. Be they infidel or faithful. Okay, the actual quotation is whether to the Turks or to the New World or to the Lutherans or to others, be they infidel or faithful, end quote. They said it and they meant it, for the Jesuits were a fitting likeness to their founding general. As a boy, Ignatius had left the gloomy castle of Loyola near the Pyrenees to enter the court of his father's noble friend. He had grown into little more than an engaging playboy, spending his days playing military games or reading popular chivalrous romances, his nights pursuing less noble adventures with local girls. But all that was before Ignatius met God at Manresa. Martin Luther emerged from his spiritual struggle convinced that the human will is enslaved, that no one can save himself. God and God alone must deliver him. Loyola came out of his struggle believing that both God and Satan are external to oneself, and a person has the power to choose between them. But the disciplined use of his imagination, by the disciplined use of his imagination, a person can strengthen his will so as to choose God and his ways. One of Loyola's spiritual exercises, for example, aimed to make the horrors of hell real. Here in imagination, the shrieks and groans and horrors of hell, shrieks and groans and horrors of hell real. This reminds me of this church that I went to forever ago, would have like this hell house thing on Halloween, and the other like kids who were helping with it, like the ones who were playing the people in hell, they like lost their voices from all their screaming to put on this show. Super weird. Okay, by the disciplined use of his imagination, a person can strengthen his will so as to choose God and his ways. One of Loyola's spiritual exercises, for example, aimed to make the horrors of hell real. And this is a quotation. Hear in imagination the shrieks and groans and blasphemous shouts against Christ our Lord and all the saints. Smell in imagination the fumes of sulfur and the stench of filth and corruption. Taste in the imagination all the bitterness of tears and melancholy and growing conscience. Feel in imagination the heat of the flames that play on and burn the souls. End quote. When he said, smell in imagination the fumes of sulfur, it reminded me of when I had COVID and I lost my sense of smell completely. And then when I started to get it back, the only thing I could smell was sulfur. Super sketch. I'm not the only person that happened to. That was like one of the common things. But anyway, yeah, I could smell nothing but sulfur for like a month. It was really nice to get my actual smell back. Okay, moving on. The same technique, of course, could be used to represent the beauties of the nativity or the glories of heaven. By proper discipline, the imagination could strengthen the will and teach it to cooperate with God's grace. For Ignatius personally, surrender to the will of God meant more education. He entered a school at Barcelona to sit with boys less than half his age to study Latin, then threw himself into a dizzying year of courses at the University of Alcala. That's Alcala. Out of it came his conviction that learning must be organized to be useful. The idea eventually grew into the Jesuits' famed plan of studies, which measured out heavy but manageable doses of classics, humanities, and sciences. Ignatius became such a fervent evangelist that the Inquisition imprisoned and examined him more than once about his life, teaching, and theology. Perturbed, he left for Paris, where he spent 7 years at the university, became Master Ignatius, and gathered around him the first of his permanent companions, Peter Faber, Diego Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Simon Rodriguez, Nicholas Bobadilla. It's Bobadilla. And above all, young Spanish nobleman Francis Xavier. Ignatius shared with them his remarkable program for sainthood, his spiritual exercises, a distillation of his religious experiences following his conversion. The exercises prescribed 4 weeks of meditations, beginning with sin, death, judgment, and hell, and then moving on to Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Ignatius intended a path to spiritual perfection, rigorous examination of conscience, penance, and a resolute amnesia about guilt once the spiritual pilgrim confronted God's forgiveness. This reminds me of me when I was like 12. This like rigorous plan. Okay, and a resolute amnesia about guilt once the spiritual pilgrim confronted God's forgiveness. The exercises became the basis of every Jesuit spirituality. Later, popes also prescribed them for candidates for ordination, and Catholic retreats applied them to laborers. Okay, we have profiles of faith. Teresa of Avila. 1515 to 1582. A young nun in Avila, Spain, struggled for years with life-threatening illness and self-torture. She found scholastic Christianity unfulfilling and began to pray by envisioning herself with Jesus when he was alone, such as when he was in Gethsemane. Eventually, she had a life-changing vision of the dying Jesus, which she considered a second conversion that filled her with love. Disturbed by the spiritual laxity of the convents, she knew she received the Pope's blessing to found new ones and started 16 Reformed Carmelite convents throughout Spain. Her deeper legacy was her writing about the life of meditation, prayer, and union with Christ. The interior castle is her most analytical description of the stages toward mystical marriage with Christ. She enlisted a monk, Juan de la Cruz, which means John of the Cross, to start Reformed Carmelite monasteries. One authored the classic The Dark Night of the Soul. I haven't read that book, but I've heard of this book many times, and I know some people who have read it. In his portrait, this is the end of the Profiles of Faith, and I'm going back to the regular text. In his portrait of the artist as a young man, James Joyce describes his young hero, Stephen Daedalus, reduced to horror by a sermon on hell. This is the quotation. A wave of fire swept through his body. Flames burst forth from his skull. After he had gone to confession, however, the past was past. That is just the way Ignatius planned it. Another quotation. Send no one away dejected. Loyola wrote, God asks nothing impossible. Thus his followers became the great apostles of the possible. It is good he added in that part where he says God asks nothing impossible, because otherwise his whole mentality would definitely send people away dejected. Okay, the Society of Jesus, next section. In 1540, Pope Paul III approved the Little Society of Jesus as a new religious order. In Ignatius's metaphor, they were to be chivalrous soldiers of Jesus, mobile, versatile, ready to go anywhere and perform any task the Pope assigned. As a recognized order, they added to their earlier vows of poverty and chastity the traditional vow of obedience to their superiors, and a fourth vow expressing their special loyalty to the Pope. They gave command to a superior general elected for life. Their choice for the first general was Ignatius. The aim of the order was simple: to restore the Roman Catholic Church to the position of spiritual power and worldly influence it had held 3 centuries before under Innocent III. Isn't that the one that wasn't very innocent? I think so. All right. Everything was subordinated to the Church of Rome because Ignatius believed firmly that the living Christ resided in the institutional church exclusively. Perhaps the most fascinating feature of the Jesuits was their perilous attempt to live energetically in the world without being of it. Loyola wanted them to be all things to all men, and they nearly succeeded. Their efforts have rallied defenders who assigned them the highest posts in heaven and critics who consigned them to the lower regions of hell. Writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1816, John Adams said, "If ever any congregation of men could merit eternal perdition on earth and in hell, it is the company of Loyola." In case anybody doesn't know, perdition is, it means a state of eternal punishment and damnation. I wrote that as a note to myself when I read this before. Which means I didn't know for sure what that meant. Whatever their destination, the Jesuits were from their beginning unique. That first generation, under Loyola's zealous leadership, rode full gallop into their new assignments: convert the heathen, reconvert Protestant Europe. Francis Xavier leaped from India to Southeast Asia to Japan, a country that had never before heard the Christian message. More than any others, the Society of Jesus stemmed and sometimes reversed the tide of Protestantism in France, the Low Countries, and Central Europe. When Ignatius died in 1556, his order was nearly 1,000 strong and had dispatched its apostles to 4 continents. No mission in that first generation proved more decisive than the band of Jesuits assigned to the Council of Trent. Only 31 council fathers, led by 3 papal legates, were present for the opening ceremonies of the councils. None of them could have guessed that their modest beginning would lead to the most important council between Nicaea, which was in 325, and Vatican II, which was from 1962 to 1965. Under the influence of the Jesuits, Trent developed into a powerful weapon of the Counter-Reformation. 2 suave, intelligent, and highly influential members of the society, Diego Lainez and Alfonso Salmeron, guided the agenda more and more toward the correct churchly attitude of the followers of Loyola. The Council Fathers met in 3 main sessions. That was from 1545 to 47, 1551 to 52, and lastly, 1562 to 63. Throughout the sessions, the Italians were strongly presented. Other areas, notably France, were significantly underrepresented. underrepresented. Compared to other councils, Trent was never well attended. During the second centuries of sessions, a number of Protestants were present, but they had little influence. From start to finish, the council reflected the new militant stance of Rome. Hey, during the Second Council, during Vatican II, from 1662 to 1665, I think that's when they started having like low church. There's like traditional Latin Mass, and then there's like the version that Michael Knowles complains about, who is a YouTuber that I listen to sometimes. Anyway, all right, like where they're trying to be like more modern. I'm thinking that's when that probably happened. Okay, next section, the shape of modern Catholicism. Everything the Protestant Reformation stood for was vigorously, one could almost say violently, rejected at Trent. The Protestant reformers emphasized justification by faith alone. The council insisted that Christian people must perform good works lest they become lazy and indifferent. Instead, the Protestant concept of external righteousness, by which God counts a person right in his eyes by faith, for Catholics, righteousness was internal. The process by which, let me reread that because I feel like I messed up that sentence. The council, I'm going to start from the very top. Everything the Protestant Reformation stood for was vigorously, one could almost say violently, rejected at Trent. The Protestant reformers emphasized justification by faith alone. The council insisted that Christian people must perform good works lest they become lazy and indifferent. Instead of the Protestant concept of external righteousness, by which God counts a person right in his eyes by faith, for Catholics, righteousness was internal, the process by which God imparts righteousness within the Christians during the course of their life. Trent emphatically linked justification to the process of becoming righteous, leaving the notion of being declared righteous to be a Protestant heresy. This is also why Catholics have purgatory. Like, they need a way to explain away that gap, I guess, between like when the person dies in the state that they're in, which is not that righteous, and then like this perfection that's still needed to actually be with God. I don't mean to put it like that for anybody who's Catholic who might end up watching this, but that's the way it looks to me. Trent emphatically linked justification to the process of becoming righteous, leaving the notion of being declared righteous to be a Protestant heresy. Luther, Calvin, and Grebel stressed salvation by grace alone. The council emphasized grace and human cooperation with God to avoid, in Loyola's terms, the poison that destroys freedom. This guy is big into free will. Luther, Calvin, and Grebel stressed salvation by grace alone. The council emphasized grace and human cooperation with God to avoid... Oh, I'm rereading the exact same section. Okay, here's a quotation. Pray as though everything depended on God alone, Ignatius advised, but act as though it depended on you alone whether you will be saved. The Protestants taught the religious authority of Scripture alone. The council insisted on the supreme teaching offices of the Roman Church, popes and bishops, as the essential interpreters of the Bible. Thus, the Council of Trent guaranteed that modern Roman Catholicism would be governed by the collaboration between God's grace and human efforts. The Pope remained, the seven sacraments remained, the sacrifice of the Mass remained, saints, confession, indulgences remained. The Council's work was unmistakably anti-Protestant. After 4 centuries, we can look back to the Reformation age and see that the religious unity of Western Christendom was permanently shattered. Men and women in Loyola's lifetime did not see that truth. The fact dawned on Europe slowly. Here we have a map. Okay, it says religious divisions at the end of the 16th century, and then it shows like Anglican, Calvinist, Catholic, Islam, Lutheran, Orthodox. Okay. Quickly take a drink. Initially, Luther's followers thought him so obviously right that the Catholic Church would inevitably adopt his reforms. Others thought him so obviously wrong that sooner or later he would be burned as a heretic and his movement would wither away. After all, the past was strewn with the corpses of heretics. The point is, both parties, Catholic and Protestant, thought that they represented the one true Catholic Church of Christ and their enemies a false version of it. That was certainly the spirit of Trent. As time went on, however, the thinking of ordinary people reached almost imperceptibly a second stage. The uneasy, half-conscious conviction grew that the conflict had reached a stalemate. Catholicism could not eradicate the new heresy, and Protestantism could not overthrow Rome. In this second stage, no one welcomed the stalemate status. They only slowly acknowledged it as a fact. The vast majority of people were still convinced that religious truth was identifiable. Truth stood on one side, error on the other. That's kind of an interesting idea. The vast majority of people were still convinced that religious truth was identifiable. I think that people think that less now. Like people who are very aware of all the different denominations. Not like it's not true, but it's like something I don't think people even think about anymore. But like back then, they took it for granted because they only literally had one church. Well, them and the Orthodox at this point. And then they had Protestants. Okay, the vast majority of people were still convinced that religious truth was identifiable. Truth stood on one side, error on the other. Error meant not only individual damnation, but infection of others and destruction of society. Okay, resistance to the dreadful evil heresy took the form of inquisitions, civil wars, and persecutions. In this ideological warfare, Calvinists and Jesuits led the charge. Each embodied a militant organization calling for doctrinal loyalty above and beyond national and political ties. At this stage, almost no one could imagine that truth could lie on both sides of the battlefield, or that both parties could peaceably coexist in the same state or even on the same continent. The third stage of ongoing religious plurality, based on the full acceptance of religious diversity within a nation, appeared before 1600 only in hints and in the attitudes of mystics. Christian humanists like Erasmus, radical Protestants like the Anabaptists, and practical politicians like Queen Elizabeth of England. Perhaps more powerful still were the political and economic forces that emerged in the newly forming nation-states. These states, with geographic boundaries that included both Protestant and Catholic citizens, would require them to coexist and cooperate. Distinctive beliefs and social practices would be tolerated if they could be transformed to become a matter of private devotion. Feeble as it was, this whisper was the voice of the future. No company of Christians resisted it more doggedly than the Jesuits.